Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Have you ever done something you were sure would make you happy, only to find yourself disappointed in some way? Do you believe you're missing out on the happiness that others experience? If so, you are not alone. Research indicates that humans are terrible predictors of their own future happiness. Making matters worse, academia has historically shied away from studying happiness because it appeared to be too difficult to define or quantify. Things have changed, and thank goodness. With the advent of positive psychology, we now have very clear science on what can increase our sense of meaning and our happiness. For this interview on the science of happiness, I had the privilege of an in-depth conversation with one of the world authorities on the subject, Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar. Tal will be sharing research about what makes us happy, and he is an ideal person to do so. Tal gained fame for teaching Harvard's most popular courses in the school's history. In 2006, his positive psychology and the psychology of leadership had over 1,400 students enrolled. He is also the author of several great books, including Happier, which is an indispensable resource to launch people on their quest for cultivating happiness. Today, Tal consults and lectures around the world to executives, as well as the general public and at-risk populations. He is the co-founder and chief learning officer of Happiness Studies Academy, Potentialife, Maytiv, and Happier TV. So listen in as Tal and I do a deep dive into the science of happiness. Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, who I will be referring to as Tal, welcome to Super Psyched.
Great to be here, Adam. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so honored. And, it's interesting. In your bio, you mentioned many of the great achievements in your career, and yet you didn't mention my absolute favorite, and that is the time that you actually summited on Mount Everest from where I sit. You actually got to sit across from Jon Stewart on The Daily Show, and I just need the listeners to know that actually happened.
I must say that wasn't an easy experience. So I was a squash player, and in squash, you're playing in a closed room, and when you're playing a player, when there is a real discrepancy, a real difference in levels, there is one player in the middle, and the other playing is running around, and literally running circles around the better player. That's how I felt with Jon Stewart. He had me sort of on a leash. He took me there and then said, no, I'm going to take it, and then I'm going to make fun of you there. So it wasn't the most pleasant experience, and yet I'm very grateful for it, as you can imagine.
And it's interesting because you were so in it and you were living between your ears during that experience. What you couldn't see was how you looked from the outside. You actually came off very well, in spite of the fact that he did give you some teasing. You came off great. So just an external perception. I thought you represented us very well, and I was I was very proud to know that you were a fellow positive psychologist. So. And for those who don't know, I probably will mention this in the intro, but Tal is a very accomplished squash player, as he mentions in his book, Happier. But as I've mentioned also, I've given out well over 100 copies of your book, Happier. It's pretty much a standard issue in my office. And without exception, everyone has said the same thing. This is a great book. And I have a lot riding on this because my credibility is also riding on the credibility of the book that I recommend. So I'm just really grateful to you for having written that. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your story. I know you were very high achieving and you were really unable to experience true happiness. I was wondering if you could talk about your journey through academia, through sports, as well as what led you finally to study happiness.
Mm. So I think from a very young age, before it was even conscious, I had it figured out in my head. And the formula for me was success leads to happiness. And there was a pre-formula to the formula, which is hard work and dedication leads to success. In other words, all I needed to do was work hard, become successful, and then I'd be happy. I remember as a squash player, I was 14, and I went to it. I was an up and coming junior player, and I went to watch a professional tournament. And obviously, the players there were 10 times better than I was at that time. But I looked at them and I said, I know how to get there. And all it would take is, these number of hours on the court, which I was more than willing to dedicate. And I did. And I trained very hard. And I must say, throughout my squash career, I didn't enjoy myself. I mean, it felt purposeful. That was the most important thing for me growing up, becoming a professional athlete. It was purposeful, but it wasn't enjoyable. And the reason why it wasn't enjoyable was because there was constant dis-ease. The saying, I felt stressed and pressure and unhappy. But I also said to myself, don't worry about it. Don't make too much of it, because once you make it, then you'll be happy. And for me, making it was initially becoming the Israeli national squash champion. And that was between the age of 16 and 17. And I got to the final and won, and was probably happier than I'd ever been before until that stage. And I finally thought, okay, now I've got it. My formula worked out, check, and I'll continue living happily ever after. Well, I was happily ever after for about 3-4 hours.
Oh my God.
And after that, back to normal. The
Reverted.
same stress, the same unhappiness as before, only now worse, because at least before that I had hope, and I said, okay, when I win, then I'll be happy. Even if I'm not happy now. Now that formula just basically was demolished, and I didn't know I was lost more than anything. Many years later, I defined the difference between sadness and depression. And the difference between sadness and depression is that depression is sadness without hope. So up until that point, I had hope. When I win, then I'll be, it was an if-then proposition. I won, I wasn't happy, I no longer had that hope, and then I really sank. However, I managed to fool myself once again. There's no limit to what our mind can do, right? And this time I said, okay, you didn't win you won the Israeli nationals, but that's not enough to be happy. What you need to do is, become a professional player, a world-ranked player, a world champion eventually. Then you'll be happy. So I continued along that line, became a professional squash player, won a few international tournaments. Did not become a world champion. I got injured quite early on in my professional career. But then I said, no worries, I'll find another goal. And then, my goal was to get into Harvard. And I said, when I get in, then I'll be happy. And I got in, and again, I was happy, but for this time more than 4 hours, but not much longer than 4 hours. And again, back to where I was before, unhappy. And it was around it was the middle of the second semester of my sophomore year in college, where suddenly I wake up one morning, and by then, by the way, I'm a computer science major, doing very well academically, doing very well in squash, even though I was injured. I still played a lot, doing okay socially. Woke up one very cold Boston morning and said, something's wrong here. My life from the outside looks great. Check, check, check. From the inside, it actually feels pretty awful. And I went to my academic advisor that morning, and I told her that I'm switching majors. And she said, what to? And I said, well, I'm leaving computer science, moving over to philosophy and psychology.
Wow.
She said, why? And I said, because I have two questions. First question is, why aren't I happy? Second question, how can I become happier? And that was the beginning, that was close to 30 years ago. And that has been my journey since. So I studied undergraduate, then went over to England, to the other Cambridge, and studied education, and then back to Harvard for my Ph.D. All the time, focusing on these questions. How can I help myself, individuals, couples, organizations, and nations increase levels of well-being?
Fantastic. And I'm thinking about Dan Gilbert, your former colleague at Harvard, who describes the human species as one that can predict its future, but tends to not predict happiness well for the future. And what I heard in your description of your own arc in your story was that you rat raced, as to use your terms. You described the rat racer who pays now to get later, and they never really get there. And I'm wondering, at what point did you begin to break into happiness?
Yeah, so I'm still breaking into happiness. It's funny. Ever since I've been in this field, people have been asking me, "So Tal, are you now finally happy?" Knowing that I got in because I was unhappy. And my response to that is, I don't know how to answer that question, because I don't think there is a point before which you're unhappy, after which you are. It's rather than being a binary 0-1, it's a continuum. So yes, today I'm happier, a lot happier than I was, in my early 20s. I certainly hope that 5 years from now, I'll be happier than I am today.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lifelong journey, a journey that ends when life ends. So to your question, I'm still breaking into happiness. A big breakthrough for sure was when I realized that the formula success leads to happiness is wrong. Not a little wrong, but very wrong. That it's not about success. There is a relationship between success and happiness, only it's the opposite. It's not that success leads to happiness, rather it's happiness leads to success. You increase levels of well-being, you become more creative, innovative, productive, you enjoy better relationships, teamwork, and you're healthier, and so on. So it's happiness that leads to success. So that was a very important and for me, novel discovery at that point. And then the question could be, okay, so if that formula of success leads to happiness, doesn't work, what formula does? And then, piece by piece, I started to put it together, and I'm still putting it together.
So like a computer scientist with an algorithm, you've been continuing to work on a different algorithm rather than for a computer program, for a life program.
Very much so. So, I still today think that my grounding in computer science and in mathematics, which was my other field, really has and continues to stand me in good stead in the pursuit of happiness, and even more so in the pursuit of teaching happiness.
It makes so much sense. The bridge between the academic with regard to happiness and the layperson can be long, in that the mere concept of marrying science and happiness is so counterintuitive. Up until just a few years ago, we wouldn't touch happiness with a 10-foot pole. For every 100 studies on depression, there was one on happiness, and probably a reluctant one at that. But we've gone the opposite direction. The pendulum has swung to the other side. We have rigorously put happiness under the microscope. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how the science of happiness was born.
So the science of happiness, I don't know if it has an exact birth date. There are a few, so, when I teach positive psychology in particular, I talk about, the father of positive psychology being Marty Seligman from the University of Pennsylvania. At the same time, it also has not just a father, it has grandparents. By the way, not just one father as well. There's Alan Langer, I was fortunate enough to study with. There is Philip Stone, who was my teacher. I mean, there are also parents of, it's a multi-parent.
Sure, Daniel Kahneman, a whole bunch of them.
Yes, exactly. There are many of them. There are also grandparents. I don't think you can talk about positive psychology without talking about Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow, and a few people know this, in 1954, so Marty Seligman announced the birth of positive psychology in 1998, when he became the president of the American Psychological Association. So that's 1998. In 1954, so 44 years prior, Abraham Maslow published a chapter with the title towards a positive psychology,
Right.
where he talked about optimism and he talked about strength, when he talked about virtues, the very things that we talk about today in research today. Now, so was it born then? I don't know. Or maybe it was born with Aristotle,
For sure.
go back 2,500 years ago, who talked about eudaimonia, who talked about the good life, who talked about many of the things that we talk about today, like, cultivating our mind, like friendship and relationships being important for happiness, like purpose, telos, and end being important for happiness. So it's difficult to really pin down the name, but when Marty Seligman, I think that the great contribution that he made was that he made it very clear, we're creating a real schism between self-help or new age and positive psychology. And the way we're doing it, and the sort of the guard at the gate, is science.
Right.
And Maslow intended to do it. He wasn't as successful, even though he himself was a very rigorous thinker. He wasn't successful in doing it for his followers. Marty Seligman has been more adamant, and more dogmatic in the most positive sense about excluding whatever it is that doesn't pass the test of science.
Yeah, mere conjecture was not sufficient. And it was my understanding that Maslow, as a phenomenologist, really did not welcome the arms of research into his work as much as, say, Seligman did or does. And that's been really to our benefit, I would say.
Yeah, and again, to Maslow's credit, there were very few people who were as smart as Maslow is. By the way, he's one of the highest recorded IQs in history.
Really?
On par or higher than Einstein and many of the others. So he was a real genius and a pathbreaker. And again, we would not have a positive psychology today without Maslow and without the humanistic psychology movement. However, I think maybe partly because of his genius, he didn't have patience to be the gatekeeper.
And I really love you honoring the grandparents, Aristotle, with eudaimonia. And I noticed even in your own video about your homeland in Israel, you interviewed your own grandmother. So I know you practice what you preach. But I used to attribute this quote to Mark Twain until I learned it was not attributable to him, but it's still a great quote. The older I get, the smarter my grandparents were, or the smarter my parents were. And one of the things that you also cite is the power of certain ancient religious practices that, sure enough, have empirical evidence that they are good for us. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that.
So I was raised in an Orthodox family. So my foundation, my grounding is in Judaism. And what I realized today, and I know that it's similar for other religions, there are so many overlaps between what science shows us today and religion. It's not one-to-one, however, there are many overlaps. So, for example, gratitude. Gratitude is such an important part of every religion, at least that I'm familiar with. Whether it's saying thank you for my daily bread, or thank you for waking up in the morning, or thank you for seeing a friend or being alive. And there's more and more research by the likes of Robert Emmons and Mike McCullough and Sonia Lubomirsky showing the benefits of regularly expressing gratitude. There's also real emphasis in religion, again, most religions, certainly in Judaism, on the Sabbath, on taking a day off. More and more research today is showing the importance of taking a day off or taking time for recovery. Another example, relationships or community. I mean, that's central. You can't have a religion without a community and without, whether it's services, whether it's celebrating of holidays together. So much part of the DNA of religion. Well, today we have research showing how important relationships are. There's a wonderful book written by Alain de Botton. And Alain de Botton is a philosopher, a great philosopher, British, Swiss, talking about religion for atheists. And Alain de Botton himself was raised an atheist and had no time for religion. And then later on in life, he realized that there are actually many important lessons that we can derive from religion. And he wrote a book on it and said, we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We ourselves don't have to be religious to believe in the existence of God, and yet that doesn't mean we can't learn a lot from very smart people who wrote many of these religious texts.
That's absolutely brilliant. I was just interviewing Dr. Mario Martinez, who has spent a lot of time with centenarians, and he found that on average, no centenarian is an atheist. They may not believe in God, but they are at the very least spiritual to the way that you've described Elaine de Botton, and that's just amazing.
But Adam, you brought up a very important word, and that is spiritual. See, there is a misconception today about spirituality. Yes, for sure, spirituality can be found in religion, and it's important. Albert Camus, who's
wonderful,
one of the leading existentialists, said, at every moment I have to make a decision. Do I have a cup of coffee or do I kill myself? Why? And, he said it, he quipped.
It's so great. That's totally
half in jest. But for a person without religion, you have to invent a sense of meaning and purpose. Whereas in religion, it's inherent. Again, one of the DNA. You know why you wake up in the morning. You know why you were put here on Earth. However, having said that, it's also possible to find a sense of meaning and therefore purpose and spirituality being secular. When we find, so an investment banker who finds meaning in her work is more spiritual than a monk who finds no meaning in his work. So it's all about finding meaning and purpose, whether we find it in religion, whether we find it in other people, in other causes.
Beautiful. And I love that Camus quote. I may find myself borrowing that. That's great. I'm thinking about the Sabbath and the importance of taking time off. And I have a term that I've coined, a non-rejuvenating rabbit hole, that we often find ourselves streaming videos on Netflix while on our devices and not getting the rejuvenation that we need. Simultaneously, I see evidence of too much technology. And as you've noted, that technology is neutral. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. And I'm wondering if there's a Goldilocks amount of technology. Is there a just right amount of technology that can increase our happiness and not deplete us?
There is. However, unfortunately, that amount is not universal.
Sure.
It's specific to you. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that, there's technology and there is technology. They're having a conversation via technology with a friend, a colleague, a family member is very useful. Certainly useful when we are in social quarantine. It contributes a great deal to happiness. Playing computer games all day long, and especially some computer games which are more violent, more explicit, perhaps. That's not helpful. So it's both the quantity and the quality of online experiences that matter. For children, especially, and this is a big challenge today, raising children, because the number one addiction today is whether for young or old. It's not alcohol or drugs or gambling anymore. It's the screen.
Sure.
And in particular, three interactions with screen. One, social media, where more and more people are absolutely obsessed with social media, and they go on and they spend hours and hours there. That doesn't make them feel good. Eric Kleinberg, who's a sociologist at NYU, has shown that there is a negative correlation between the amount of time we spend on social media and loneliness. Meaning the more time we spend.
I got it. The more time we spend on social media, the more lonely we become.
So there's a negative correlation with happiness, and so that's one form. The other is pornography, where more and more, and I've had these conversations with heads of states about worrying about their countries where kids are not, kids or young adults are not dating. And the reason they're not dating is because, they get their fix, so to speak, online. And again, it's not just, young adults. It's, at almost every age, the consumption of pornography and addiction to online pornography. That's the second one. And the third one, a third form of screen addiction, games. So where kids can spend many, many hours in front of that screen. And again, a very high price because they don't cultivate normal social interaction abilities, and empathy levels are declining rapidly, and they're not moving. So they're not exercising. So we pay a very, very high price for this form of addiction today.
Yeah. I also imagine that there is a negative correlation between happiness and the amount of time we sink into watching the news and a whole host of other things that there's a Goldilocks amount for each one of us, and it's probably variable. And I'm also thinking this is all the more salient. Here we are in the midst of COVID, and the perception of the availability of activities has shrunk. Those activities actually still may be available. They just may require some creativity, but we go for the low-hanging fruit. We go for, let's just anesthetize the kids and let them watch TV, or more simply, let's have them play video games with their friends. At least it's social. And then 12 hours have gone by and they've been on Fortnite for the last 12 hours. Yeah. During COVID, what would be some of your top tips to ensure that individuals and families are more engaged and a little bit happier?
Yeah, first, I think the first thing we need to accept is the fact that it's hard. The fact that, anxiety levels are very high during these times. The fact that frustration is high, because if you're locked up in the, same building,
right,
with the same people, no matter how amazing and easygoing they are, you are, you'll have friction, you'll have conflicts. So first of all, embracing anxiety, embracing frustration, giving ourselves what I've come to call the permission to be human. Because when we reject painful emotions like anxiety, like anger, like frustration, these emotions only intensify, they grow stronger. So that's the first thing, embrace painful emotions. I think one of perhaps the first pillar of happiness is allowing in unhappiness. So, allow it, bring it in. There is a wonderful poem by Rumi, the Sufi poet from 800 years ago or so, who wrote about the guest house. And the guest house is what he says there is: bring in all the emotions, all the thoughts, whatever they are, welcome them as your guests. They're here to help you, to serve you. So that's the first step. The second step, it's very important to create rituals during any time, but certainly during COVID and social isolation. Why? Because people ask me, so what are you doing differently during these times? So, and I say to them, I do the same things, only more often. So, if I exercise on a regular basis and every other day during normal time, get whatever normal means, but usually 3 times a week, every other day. During COVID, it's up to 5 times a week. Why? Because I'm a little bit more, the base level is a bit more anxious than usual. I need more of, my anti-anxiety fix, which is exercise. I do a bit more than usual meditation and yoga. The other thing, relationships are always important. It's actually the number one predictor of happiness, and by the way, also physical health.
Right.
So relationships are also important, but I carve out even more time for having deep, intimate conversations, whether it's with obviously my family, who's the same home as me, but also with friends. So just before our conversation, I had a wonderful intimate conversation online with a dear friend of mine, and that really refuels and rejuvenates. And having these rituals, healthy rituals in place, is very important. Also, negative rituals. At the beginning of COVID, when we were first locked up, I became addicted to or obsessed by the news. Every morning I would get up and immediately check, so what's the graph looking like in this city, adjoining city, in the country, in the world, and how are we doing? When is this? And I became obsessed with it. And it wasn't good, wasn't healthy, because, what the news doesn't reflect reality. It doesn't mirror reality. It's not a looking glass. Rather, it's a magnifying glass.
Sure.
And it magnifies the problems. It magnifies what's not good. It magnifies it makes the sensational even more sensational.
Right.
So that you're hooked and addicted to it. Not healthy. Right. So I have negative rituals, which is I don't open the news between certain hours. So yes, when I wake up in the morning, I quickly look through it to see if there's anything there. And then for the next 6 hours, I just do my work. If the world comes to an end, I figure, people will tell me about it. I don't need to check it. Make sure I see it on the news first. And then I have a little session again of the news, and that's it for the day. After that, I hang out with my family. I read. I use healthy distractions. I was thinking about distractions, and I looked up. Like you, I love quotes. So I looked up quotes on distraction because I wanted to teach about it.
Sure.
I couldn't find a positive quote about distraction. Everything was bad, and that's unfortunate because there are also healthy distractions.
For sure.
I'm saying distracting ourselves from bad news,
yes.
Or from people talking constantly about, whether it's the protests or whether it's the COVID-19. Now, it's important not to bury our head in the sand, but we shouldn't overdo it.
Right. We can overtax ourselves. It's very valuable real estate. And we have to, I'm guessing, to your point earlier, really know ourselves and our capacities for that type of information and make sure the cup doesn't spill over. And I think that's brilliant. What have been some other, you've really looked at very deeply to counter the idea of us not being good predictors of our future happiness? What are some what are your favorite go-tos for most people? Of course, it won't work for everyone, but what are your favorite kind of practices that may help people boost their happiness?
Right. So just elaborating a little bit on the first one that I talked about, which is allowing in unhappiness. So what do we actually do to give ourselves the permission to be human? So one thing to do is to shed a tear, open the floodgates. It's not for nothing. There are physiological reasons, psychological reasons why we feel better after a good cry. So that's one way of expressing emotion. Another way is journaling. There is a wonderful work done by Janie Pennybaker from University of Texas, Laura King, Chad Burton, many others on journaling and showing just the benefits. And by the way, probably the mother of journaling, whom I also consider one of the grandmothers of positive psychology, is Karen Horney. Karen Horney wrote she was a student of Freud and then broke away from Freud at some point where she argued that Freud looks too much on the dark side, and she says there is so much bright side. Again, not detached, Pollyannic bright side, but grounded optimism. Anyway, so she wrote a book back in, I think it was 1935, on self-analysis.
Right.
Where she said, look, it's no substitute for therapy, of course. However, as a supplement to, in addition to, or if you can't afford for one reason or another therapy, then use journaling and self-analysis. And there's a lot of truth there. So journaling is important, an important way of giving ourselves the permission to be human. And finally, talking about it. There's great research by Sonia Lubomirsky, who's a happiness researcher from UC Riverside. And she shows how when we experience emotional pain, there are three ways of dealing with it. One is thinking about it, ruminating about it. One is writing about it, and finally talking about it. And what she shows is that when we either talk about it or write about it, we benefit. It actually goes away just as it came. Whereas when we just think about it and ruminate about it, not healthy.
Terrible.
Yeah. So we go into actually a downward spiral rather than grow out of it or grow through it.
Which makes a lot of... Awesome.
Yeah. So, this is why therapy works.
Yeah.
Because, we talk about it, and 50 minutes later, we feel so much better. So that's some of my staple go-to. Physical exercise. I'm not a therapist like you, but if I were a therapist, Adam, the first thing that I would ask, maybe the second. First, I'd ask for their name. But the second thing that I would ask was, are you exercising regularly? Because if not, then I would more than urge them to go ahead and do it. Why? Because we weren't born to be sedentary. Our forefathers and mothers were constantly active, hunting, gathering, running away from, running after. Whereas today we're too sedentary, and our nature needs us to move. So if if we don't move, if our natural state of well-being is here and we don't move, we actually suffer for it. It goes down. That's why I often talk about not exercising is like taking a depressant. And to exercise, that's how we go back to our natural state and can then work on that. So exercise is big for me. I'm also very much into mindfulness, but mindfulness broadly defined, being present. Mindfulness is present moment awareness. I can be mindful present to a breath going in and out. I can be mindful and present yoga asana, a posture. I can also be really present listening to music. And, interesting, so many people ask me, so what is the best music to listen to in terms of impact? And there's actually an empirical answer to that. It was introduced by Oliver Sacks.
I love him.
So he talks about in his book, Musicpedia, about the best kind of music to listen to. And you know what the best kind of music is?
I have a hunch.
Your favorite music.
That's what I thought, yeah.
So, if
good.
It's classical, great. If it's 60s, also great. These, by the way, are my two favorites. If it's modern rock, so be it. If it quite literally, not metaphorically, lights up our brain when we listen to our favorite music, and if we do it mindfully, not just as background, that's really very, very helpful. So being mindful in whatever way, that is very important. And something else is I'm a big believer in action, actually much more so than in words. Yeah, there is one of my favorite books is by Richard Wiseman.
Mm-hmm.
His name suggests he really is a wise man. Teaches in Hertfordshire in the UK. And he has a book called The As-If Principle. And the As-If Principle is actually a principle that was introduced by William James back in 1890. And the idea is that act as if, and then fill in the gap. So let's say I'm not confident, but I want to cultivate confidence. Well, act as if you're confident, meaning take your shoulders back, stand up straight. Speak with an assertive voice, even if you don't feel like it. In other words, fake it until you become it.
Exactly.
You want to, you're feeling down, and first of all, give yourself the permission to be human. But second, maybe go and dance, because dancing really does improve our mood. Or speak with people, even if you don't really feel like it, you'll feel better as a result. Act as if. So that's another important element of habit.
I love that so much. The fake it till you become it, kind of the Amy Cuddy as well, kind of has talked quite a bit about it. Another one of your former colleagues, I believe. Tal, you speak about so many things, and you are just such a font of knowledge. I mean, if anybody wants to geek out and just watch videos on YouTube and get to know your work, read your stuff, listen to it on Audible, find any podcast. There's just so many paths of delight that you've provided. One of them was the fallacy of multitasking. You have noted that our IQ can go down by 10 points when we multitask, even though we don't perceive it. And that's a significant amount. Just to give apparently it's as much as 36 hours of sleep deprivation, and it's more than smoking a lot of marijuana. I was wondering if you could speak about the fallacy of multitasking and what people should do instead, because so many people, especially in Silicon Valley where I work, live under the belief that to meet the demands of their job, they must multitask. What's true and what should they do instead?
Yeah, so, I think that the problem here is not so much the multitasking, it's that we must multitask all the time. So, some multitasking is inevitable. Certainly we know that there is research going back to the 60s and, up until present day about managers and leaders. Part of their day is multitasking. They have to know how to juggle things. That's okay. What's not okay is the attempt to multitask constantly without any experience of single tasking. We need to single task. We need what I've come to call islands of sanity throughout our day. For when we're only doing one thing, and that one thing can be just emails or just interacting with a colleague, or only writing that report or reading or whatever it is. But what some of my ex-colleagues, again, Leslie Perlow and Teresa Mabile, both at Harvard Business School, have shown is that leaders who have 1 to 2 hours a day of single tasking, when they're really focusing on just one thing, are overall more productive, more creative. They're also happier as a result of being mindful, at least for a part of the day. Now, if you can do it for more than 2 hours a day and you can do it for your 8 hours of work day, wonderful. However, it's important to keep in mind that it's not an all or nothing proposition. Meaning either I single task all day and am mindfully engaged all day, or let me just continue business as usual. No, small changes can make a big difference when applied consistently.
Oh, that's so good. One of the other things I love that you say is learn to fail or fail to learn. And you've also written a book on perfectionism. I imagine you've studied it a great deal. I was wondering if you could give some advice to the perfectionist, as well as those who love perfectionists.
Yes. Well, I had and have a front seat to perfectionism, being one myself. And in addition to it, just like I studied happiness, the research on it because of my own unhappiness, I studied perfectionism because I struggled with it. And, perfectionism has become sort of not a real neurosis, even though the same Karen Horney, talks about perfectionism as a real, sinister, harmful perfectionism. And the reason why it has been misunderstood on many levels is because, you ask people, job interview, what is your weakness? Oh, I'm a perfectionist. I get everything done so well and I'm so conscientious. Yeah, perfectionism is a weakness, but, I'll hire you. So perfectionism, the confusion is that there are two sides to perfectionism. There is what psychologists call adaptive perfectionism, and there is maladaptive perfectionism. Adaptive perfectionism is being a hard worker. That's great. Being responsible, being conscientious, wonderful. The maladaptive perfectionism, the downside of perfectionism, is being obsessed with failure, fearing failure to the point where it's debilitating. Now, being afraid of failure is natural. No one likes to fail. However, an obsession with failure, that's harmful, that's destructive. And this is the kind of perfectionism that I write about and talk about. And this is what has led to so much pain in my life and in the life of so many others, because for example, one of the characteristics associated with perfectionism is defensiveness. So why? Because if someone disagrees with me, then that's a chink in my armor. That's an imperfection in the way I think or the way I appear to others. So I immediately become defensive. No. I mean, everything is right. We know, unfortunately, some politicians who are obsessed with whenever they're criticized. Why? Because they can't handle being wrong or saying, I don't know, or I'm sorry, my bad. So it leads to much unhappiness for the individual and also for the environment. Because when we don't embrace, and I mean embrace, failure, we also don't learn. We don't grow. If you think about, I often ask my students to imagine a world where they didn't fail. Now, every time they fail, they always thought, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. Now, imagine that your wish came true and you hadn't done that. Look back on your life, no failure. Where would you be today? I suspect that you wouldn't be in as good a place as you are right now because of this truism, which I utter to myself, to my kids, to my students and clients: learn to fail or fail to learn. There is no other way to grow. That's how we learn how to walk, by falling down. That's how we learn how to eat, by making a mess. That's how we in a relationship. David Schnarch, who's one of my favorite relationship psychologists, he says that you're not ready for marriage. Marriage makes you ready for marriage.
Wow.
In other words, it's failure, it's conflict, it's hardship that make. Also, parenting, I find the same thing. So our eldest kid is now 60, just turned 16, David. And when he was 6 years old, I went to one of my best friends in the whole world, Shirley Yuval. And she's a psychologist, and she's a child psychologist, and she's my go-to person whenever I have, kids issues. So I went to her and I said to her, Shirley, I wish I knew 6 years ago what I know today. I wouldn't have made all these mistakes with David. And she says to me, Tal, don't worry, you would have made other mistakes. and that also goes back to the work of Donald Winnicott about the good enough mother or the good enough father. Mistakes are important. They're important for us to grow. Mistakes are important also that we make for our children so that they can deal with imperfections. And they don't need perfect models. They don't need a perfect life. You don't grow in a vacuum.
That is so incredibly brilliant. I love the idea of actually asking a person to really introspect and think about the mistakes they've made and what they've taught, and that there is really no wisdom without mistakes. And I'm a big fan of Winnicott as well. One of his big ideas was psychological health is letting another person know who you are and knowing another person. And that involves so much vulnerability and
building on Winnicott, David Schnarch applied this idea to intimate relationships between lovers, and he studied relationships that have flourished and thrived after 10, 20, 30 years, because we usually think, okay, there is the honeymoon effect, excitement, passion, and then we go down
the descent.
Descend, and let's see if we can sustain something of
Sure.
what he had. Whereas he studied relationships where passion has actually grown over time, where the best relationship was one not at the beginning, but actually 30, 40 years later, where passion actually grew over time. And what is the number one determinant of this process or this trend? Intimacy. And how do you develop intimacy? By knowing and being known. By knowing and being known, which is the same idea as Winnicott.
That upload and download, they are so crucial in this life. If I may, one last question for you. If you were suddenly conferred with magical powers and could give the planet, every single inhabitant, one trait or one skill that would boost the individual's happiness as well as collectively society's happiness, what trait would you give?
Persistence. Persistence, which is associated with resilience. There is a double standard that I've noticed for years, and the double standard goes as follows. So you say to someone, okay, or someone decides I want to be a great musician, or I want to be a great athlete. Immediately, the next step is okay, and I'm going to practice and invest in hard work and become better. And yet, when it comes to happiness, just about everyone says, "Yeah, I want to be happy or happier. I want to have the good life." And what do? They don't invest in it. They think, well, somehow if I read a book, then there'll be magical powers, and somehow a magic wand, and I'll live happily ever after. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in relationships. Movies end where love begins. The hard work begins after. You give the vows. So hard work, persistence is necessary in relationships. It's necessary in the individual, intrapersonal, the individual realm, becoming happier. And just as it's important if you want to become a better musician or an athlete.
That's interesting. I've always felt a unilateral brotherhood with you. You did not know about my existence, but my mantra is be willing to suck at something for a long time, because from that space of being willing to suck and press on, and that's where all good things come from. Yeah, you have to be willing to suck.
I couldn't agree more. Suzuki, the Zen master, talked about the beginner's mind.
Absolutely,
the willingness to suck is the beginner's mind embodied.
I'm so grateful to you. Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom. I'm sure my listeners are going to benefit hugely. Your vitality just comes through.
Thank you.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.